We are here to, can everybody hear me? Sure. We are here to celebrate the life of Edward James Gorman. And I do mean celebrate. We've had 5 or 6 weeks to think about it and, what's the right word? Sympathize with everybody and the loss of Jim. And today is meant to be a celebration. So it's a great crowd. Thank you all for coming. Jim has passed and gone to heaven, and we will see him again someday. Cowboy Jim. So welcome everybody. And now we'll have the, if I say this right, the eulogy. Oh, we're going to do the Lord's Prayer first. Okay. I'm not following this because I didn't bring my glasses. But if everybody could stand, remove cover. Oh, yeah. And we shall say the Lord's Prayer. Our Heavenly Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Amen. Okay. Ted.
Thank you, Joe.
That's you.
My name is Ted Maney, and I met our cowboy a little over 2 years ago only. I'm late to the party here with the rest of you. He came to our church to prepare for baptism. And that was the time I got to know him. Although he's the same age as my dad, I got to be his godfather. How cool is that? And I also got to be one of his drivers. Less thrilling, but that's when my buddy Bob there did a bit of driving for him too, and Tony got to do some driving, as many of you have. But that's when I got to learn some of the stories about his life. And I'm excited to be here today because I only have the last couple of years, but you have, in aggregate, between all of us, right? We can fill in a lot of those stories about his life, and I'm looking forward to hearing those today from those who knew him much better than I did. Perhaps it's fitting we're meeting on a Saturday, right? When his beloved Notre Dame football team is competing again. Kickoff in, what do we got here, in 16 minutes against Clemson. I'm sorry Jim is missing out on a winning season, actually, for the Fighting Irish. But maybe he's got great seats.
Yeah.
On the game today. We can only hope. Thank you, Andy, for all the time that you took and the work to put together this biography of your father, this obituary, and to trust me with reading it for you at the ceremony. And I'm relying on all of you to fill in the gaps that we leave today during the ceremony. So Jim was born Edward James Gorman. I didn't really know he went by Jim for a long time. When he showed up at church, he said, "Call me Ed." Later, I went to pick him up one day. He was usually always out on the porch, ready to go. He wasn't there that day, so I went up and knocked on the door, and Dawn came out. We didn't know each other. She was looking at me, and I said, "Well, is Ed here?" He had a longer look. "What are you smoking?" I think she figured it out pretty darn quick, right? She's a quick study. But later, I talked to Ed, Jim. I've been Jim all my life, because my dad took my name. He had to be Ed, so I had to go by my middle name. Because my father's passed, there's another family member that was Edward. This is my turn to use the name, my turn. So we knew him as Ed. He was always Jim, Cowboy Jim to all of you. He was born on August 3rd, 1938, in Anchorage Territory, the only child of Edward and Madge Gorman. Fate brought them together at a dance in the Seattle-Tacoma area, and almost immediately, Jim's father Ed got a job in Alaska and had quite an adventure getting from Seattle to Alaska with a buddy in a small boat they borrowed an engine transplanted from his buddy's car to power the boat, and a jury-rigged cabin for shelter in an otherwise open boat, which they piloted with only a small compass. Cowboy Jim can boast a lineage of scrappy and resourceful folks, that's for sure. He was born some 9 months later. His dad, Ed, was injured in a fall, and after recovering, took a job in Panama, leaving Jim and his mother alone in Alaska for some time. But after Pearl Harbor, little 3.5-year-old Jim and his mother packed up quickly with the help of Jim's uncle, and they came back to the mainland to get away from the anticipated threat the war posed to the Alaskan coast. Some of the memorabilia on the table, I hope you had a chance to look at it. Some of them are from the ship that Ed's mother and he took to go from Alaska back to the mainland. Once back in Washington, they moved in with Jim's mother's family at a wheat ranch in Wenatchee, where they had 72 horses and 8 mules. And this begins a magical time for a small boy who came into contact with his life's passion for horses that he encountered there. While still in primary school, he was hooked. He had a bad case of horse fever. Little Jimmy was able to ride a horse to and from school, and grandpa, uncles, and older cousins began to teach him his first lessons in horsemanship. Jim's cousins, Merle and Elsie Jacobson, still own the ranch today, and visited with Andy and Jim just last December, and they were able to go there. Well, Jim's father got a job in Portland and moved his wife and son there. Jim graduated from Jefferson High School in 1956, then studied animal husbandry at Oregon State University, and was in the Marine Corps ROTC program for a time before enlisting in the Marines. He was also doing rodeos, riding rough stock, and roping. He got to drive 6-horse teams, pulling stagecoaches, providing hay rides on buckboard wagons at Jansen Beach during the summers. While in the Marines, Jim drove trucks and operated tanks, staying in the active reserves until 1969. On some lucky day in 1959, however, Jim met Sharon Cutsworth, queen of the Morrow County Rodeo from Hefner, Oregon. And they were married in the summer of '61. Jim and Sharon decided to run off to marry in Reno. You might say they eloped, but in this case, they drove to Reno with Jim's future mother-in-law and stepfather along for the ride in the back seat of an old Buick. It's been a fun weekend. According to Sharon, she and Jim moved some 25 times in the next 5 years, living in every state on this side of the Mississippi except for 2. Jim was chasing his career, training, and getting his apprenticeship in horse racing and cutting horses. But his first love was stock horses. He had a reputation of being one of the very best colt trainers around. He apprenticed with at least a dozen well-known trainers from Texas to California, including Glenn Randall, the man who trained Roy Rogers' famous horse Trigger. Part of Jim's life was directly or indirectly related to Hollywood and horses. He got to meet Bob Hope and Bing Crosby at the Portland racetrack. And during his racehorse training days and through the 1970s, he got to work with many Hollywood stars as a horse handler, including the Clint Eastwood movie, Paint Your Wagon, filmed out in Baker, Oregon. And he was hired to do some beer commercials for Anheuser-Busch down in California. Amidst all this, Jim's son Andy was born in November of 1963. And 5 years later, Jim and the family moved back to Hefner, Oregon, to start building what he called his horse training plant. But on Andy's 5th birthday, Thanksgiving morning, a fire broke out from an old wood-fired stove while Sharon was cooking breakfast for little Andy. She got the boy safely outside, screamed at Jim, who then ran the 200-yard dash from the barn to the house in chaps and spurs to salvage what they could as smoke filled the burning house. Nearly everything was destroyed, except for the 2 pumpkin pies his mother had cooling on the back porch, and Andy's 4 silver dollar turtles. Hope they lasted a long time, Andy. Stressful day. Their lives safe, they recovered in Ione, Oregon, with Sharon's parents. The community really rallied around them and put on a fundraiser to help them rebuild and replenish. It's not long after this, they moved to Floyd Jones Ranch, where Andy fondly remembers how the beautiful stallion Jim trained, Pat Brady, would jump the corral fence to eat the green grass in their yard, then walk up on the porch and look through the window to see what was going on inside the house. Jim spun a yarn, of course, and told Andy that the horse was looking through the window just to see what Andy was having for breakfast. Jim and Sharon had a scare with Andy falling from that stallion's back, nearly dying of a skull fracture. In those days, it was only a 2-lane highway to the hospital in Portland. But after 3 resuscitations in the ambulance on the way and a few weeks in the hospital, Andy finally got to go home, and his frightened parents finally got a good night's sleep. In 1968, Jim and Sharon divorced, and Jim went out to Baker to work as a horse handler on the movie Paint Your Wagon. He worked for several movie stars, training horses and giving riding lessons, including Peter Breck, who played Nick Barkley on The Big Valley, and Robert Pastorelli, who played Timmons, the mule skinner on Dances with Wolves. Jim and Sharon decided to try again, and in 1971, they remarried, and the next summer they welcomed their second son, Michael. Unfortunately, the couple divorced again later that year. Along the way, Jim kept working and collecting awards and trophies, many buckles, checks, and other prestigious awards. Many of his students won awards on various horses too, and we're glad that so many of those students are here today. There are too many competitions to list now, but you will see a few on display here behind me. Sharon eventually remarried, but in September of 1981, she and her new husband were killed in a private airplane accident in Ketchikan, Alaska. Andy was 17, just starting his senior year in high school, and Mike was 9 years old, entering 3rd grade. The boys were taken in by Sharon's family. Jim was at that time training out of Enumclaw on the Stoltz farm. He had remarried to Astrid Thurston, originally from Switzerland, whom he met in California in the 70s. They were living in Enumclaw, but then moved to Portland to be closer to Jim's parents since his father had a stroke in late 1982. Astrid also trained horses and competed as a rider. She was bright, could speak 7 languages, had done some professional acting and modeling, and was a veterinary tech. She passed away in 1995. Jim continued to train horses and make friends. In the Sandy, Oregon region, he worked at Mount Hood Barn Stables, Camelot Farms, Boyko Ranch, and Peterson Ranch. Then he had the opportunity to train for Tom and Tana Thompson out in Goldendale, Washington, so he took it. Jim sold the family home and moved with his mother to Goldendale, where he continued his trade and enjoyed a bit of drier climate. Jim made many new friends there, including George and Peggy Sheradella, Chris Ballard, and many others. Jim lived and worked in Goldendale for several years until he was badly injured while unloading a trailer load of hay by himself in the snow. Typical Jim, huh? A broken back and banged up shoulder would slow anyone down. And Jim was now in his 70s. He needed multiple back surgeries and a place to regroup and heal. And Andy took his father in to live with him in his home in Tigard while helping to navigate his father's surgeries and his overall recovery. Now, it's no surprise that Cowboy Jim was getting cabin fever in the worst way possible living in Tigard. And it was just a few days after Andy had loaded up his travel trailer and left for Dayton in southeast Washington for a big job that Jim had actually recommended Andy take with the Thompsons. So Andy's left the house, and here's when Cowboy Jim made his break. He slipped out of Tigard, moved in with Joe and Don Thompson, where he could be around their livestock and mess with horses all he wanted. So then it was about only 2 months later, you're tracking the whole story here, right? Following this timeline? 2 months later, when Joe and Andy were visiting on the job site, and Joe let it slip that Cowboy Jim was living at his house and riding his wife's horse, Vanna White, that Jim had previously trained for Don. As Andy tells it, his mouth hit the ground. He said, "Jim has moved in with you folks and he's riding a horse? I just got him through 2 back surgeries. I'm gonna kill him." Joe was falling over himself laughing, realizing that Andy was clearly not in the loop here. But what could we expect? A Marine and a cowboy. The worst possible combination. An Irish to boot. Jim continued to stay at Joe and Don Thompson's place, feeding and doctoring horses and giving training advice. It gave Cowboy Jim purpose to feed and water the horses and assist around the farm in these final years. It seems Jim and the Thompsons adopted each other, including the Thompson boys, Jake and Jace, who are becoming accomplished young riders. Jace has done exceptionally well over the years, giving Cowboy Jim and the Thompson family a lot of pride. Joe and Don have been so gracious in hosting Jim for nearly the past 10 years at their home and as a member of their family. Jim, having lived such a very active life, was now quite aware of his increasing frailty. He was dependent on a cane to walk, keep him steady, on hearing aids to hear well, and his eyes were well past the help of any prescription lenses. He no longer drove a car, relying on drivers when he needed to get into town. But he kept up a steady pace, caring for the horses, just with a bit of a slower step. He could still listen to the news and let you know what he really thought about the latest crop of Democratic leaders. He could still follow his beloved Notre Dame football team and maintain his lifelong curiosity and desire for learning and sharing ideas, including watching YouTube videos on all sorts of topics with his slick new iPad. And this is when I met the old cowboy, when he entered the parish office where I work in the summer of 2021, asking to be baptized. He became emotional in that first meeting, aware that time was running out, and he had many reasons to be seeking to be reconciled with God. He received the sacraments of initiation at Easter in 2022, and afterwards shared the incredible joy and peace that this brought him. Not on the day itself. He had again fallen that morning. He felt terrible. But after all that work getting ready for the big day, he gutted it out. I don't think the pictures here show that. But it was pretty quickly thereafter, you know, that 36 hours after that he felt physically better, and gosh, the joy and peace that he felt that whole next couple of weeks was amazing that he shared with all of us. And it was not long after this that he had a vivid dream which really challenged him. He shared how he was aware of a beautiful light, felt an amazing peace while perceiving Jesus in front of him. He was sure this was it. He was finally going to be able to experience eternal life. But he was shocked when he heard Jesus say that this was not his time. He would be going back. Oh, Jim felt so frustrated by his tease of the life hereafter. But it brought him some consolation that he was on the right path. So in mid-June of this past summer, Jim began experiencing more serious health issues. He had a stroke that earned him 6 weeks of recovery between hospital and rehab center. Finally released in late July and able to go home. Always a prankster, he was wheeled out wearing a big red clown's nose. A photo of that here. Even kept it on for an errand to go to the local bank, making people giggle. And then to the Bigfoot Tavern for a tall, cold, black butte porter. He was so happy to celebrate being out of the hospital. But just a couple weeks later, while exiting the car, Jim took another fall. Poor guy, fracturing his skull on the edge of a sidewalk. And things went downhill from there. The headache was persistent. He was no longer able to chat in his typical relaxed style. Edward James Gordon, our cowboy Jim, went to the Lord on September 16, 2023, at Ray Hickey Hospice House in Vancouver, Washington. Cowboy Jim surely touched the lives of many and leaves behind a legacy of passion, dedication to his craft, and enduring memories with family, friends, co-workers, and students. He'll be dearly missed by all who had the privilege of knowing him. Thank you. There are copies of an even longer version of this with more details that Andy had put together, if you wish, and they're available on the reading table right behind the programs that you have, so you can read more about that if you want. Thank you for your attention.
What do you want me to do? You're up.
Jim would say that you were like herding cattle.
Say what?
Say you were like herding cattle.
Herding cow?
Herding.
Good dog. Yeah. All right. Andy has, everybody knows Andy. You don't. It's an experience. Yeah. I think you're reading something here. Jim's Adventure.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Appreciate that very much. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to try and speak loud, and I'm not going to try and eat the microphone. My father was an interesting fellow. He never knew what was going to happen, but he geared his life up for adventure. There's a lot of things behind me. Well, I think most of you folks have had a chance to maybe look at. In the 70s, when he was, after he finished, I guess in '69 is when he did he was a horse handler with Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin and H. Wagon. Probably most of you have seen that movie at one time or another. Some of the sideline stories of the mischief that they got into over there in Baker with Jimmy Gibbs and Bob Tallman and some of those other folks that maybe you might remember some of those names. Bob Tallman was a radio announcer for long rodeos, and he was also a Western wear retailer over in that country in the Cowden. Jim Gibbs was my dad used to chase wild horses back in the 50s up in the Blue Mountains with Jim Gibbs and Bob, and there's a few others. They got in a world of trouble there in Pendleton at the Westford Hotel. They'd met a couple of ladies from New York, pretty blondes, that happened to be visiting, and they got to drinking a little bit there in the Westford Hotel there. The ladies asked him, "Are you real cowboys?" He says, "Well, yes, we're real cowboys." "Well, can you prove you're real cowboys? We'd like to see a wild horse." Well, Jim Gibbs says, "Well, if you really want to see a wild horse, you line the drinks up here on the bar and we'll be right back." So they walked outside, they hailed a taxi, caught a ride down to the roundup room down there at the Letterbuck room, or roundup grounds. Jim Gibbs reached down in there and grabbed a colt horse that they took away from his mother, and they stuffed it in the back seat of that taxi cab, and Jim jumped back there in the back and bit his ear all the way down Main Street where the hotel was. They had a rope around it. They let it into the hotel. There happened to be a couple of local fellas in there that was drinking more than everybody else was, and they let out a yeehaw, run over there and slapped that horse on the ass, and that thing started bucking and kicking and kicked a hole in the bass drum and got all of them thrown right out of that place. So those are some fun stories, you know, that actually happened. And that did not have this story actually prepared for this event, but whatever. So when he was doing the Hollywood stuff, he happened to meet several different people. He met one particular producer, and he was an executive for Warner Brothers. And if y'all happen to notice, there was an envelope up here from Warner Brothers, and inside that envelope is a letter where my father had presented an idea for them to write a movie over his experiences, okay? So they kind of had a pre-arrangement agreement to look at his writings. Well, Dad wrote about 10 or 12 chapters. He wrote this, had this type, remember the old pig, what do they call it, onion skin typing paper back in the 70s? You know, it was easy to erase on. Of course, this is before computers, you know. All right, so when we tried to photocopy it, it was so darn light you couldn't read the darn thing. But we had it retyped, and as of last night, we decided not to recite that particular story. But if you would like to have some fun reading it, if you all go back up to the book here and throw an email on there, or give me a call or something, I'll send it to you and y'all can read it that way. 28 pages is going to be too long for me to be up here, and I don't have enough alcohol. So that's about as best as I can put that. I do want to show some big appreciation for Dawn and Joe Thompson, Dawn and her crew here for all of this work. Joe and I and Jace were down at the coast working on a federal job down there, and we couldn't get away up here. We didn't have internet or cell service to be able to do a whole lot. Rebecca back here was a big help in the office for me, and of course there's many others that I'm not going to be able to remember, but I'm hoping I'm hitting the right numbers here. Thank you so much. I know Dad would be appreciative of this. So now we're going to start the close stuff.
After the open mic, we're going to, Andy will be back up to raise a glass or a toast to them.
Yep.
So to get ready with their info and
Okay, so we'll have an open mic. So be prepared if you have a story to come on up. And then after that, we're going to do a toast to Jim and his life. So,
And you're gonna eat some more.
and more food. So come on up and give us a Jim story. Oh, yeah.
I can't even tell you how many years ago I met Jim.
Closer to your face.
Oh, I won't eat it, right? Anyway, I met him years ago. I took my Arabian Stallion to him when he was down in Oregon at Mount Hood Equestrian Center to train. And then he took him to a place where he had a round pen and whatnot. And he's going to ride him. I said, you know, that horse has never been ridden. Be careful you don't get bucked off. And he looks at me and he goes, Arabians can't buck. And I said, well, be careful. Next thing I know, he goes around the corner and goes boom, boom, boom on his shoulder. And I said, you see, you gotta start listening to me once in a while. You know, and then my next thing is that he decides he's going to teach me how to rope. And he gave me a rope and he said, this is what you do and how to throw it. And I thought, wow, this is fun. So he gave me one of his old ropes to take home and play with. He didn't tell me not to rope the thistle, the big bull thistle. That's why I threw it around all the time and went, oh no, how do I get it off? It was so tight and stickery, and I went, thanks a lot, Jim. But, you know, and then I was at Don's and helped him when he foaled. What horse was that?
That was the last one, 6 years ago.
Yes, 6 years ago. And it brought back so many memories, and it was so nice. And it was so much fun to have a guy show up with rubber gloves on. He was so prepared. And what a guy. You know, he taught my little brother how to ride and worked with my nieces, and he was always there. You called him and he'd go, come on over and I'll show you how. I should have called him and said, come and show me how to get my rope off the thistle. That was then, this is now. Anyway, I know he's going to be missed by everybody, and you know, and I'm so sad for your loss and yours, Dawn, and your family. But what a great life he had. And I see all the smiling, glowing faces, and I know that he affected everybody like he affected me. Anyway, somebody else's turn. I have to shut up.
I don't really have anything prepared, but Jim meant a lot to me, and I'm looking at the faces here of all the students that he's had, and many of which decided to forge their careers training horses because of him. And Jim and I actually go back a long way because, again, he was married to Sharon Cutsforth, and she is a cousin by marriage, because on my mother's side of the family we were Kilkennys, and we had property in Morrow County, and my granddad grew up there on a sheep ranch. So really how Jim and I started talking was the history, being Irish, going back to Morrow County, who he was married to, being part of our family, and of course the love of Notre Dame football. My husband played for Notre Dame, and so he absolutely loved my husband, John. But I became a student of Jim's in the late 90s. I decided to take a break from corporate America. I was sick of it, and I wanted to become a better rider. And I'd grown up riding horses. Wayne over there was one of the first trainers I ever worked with in Seaside, where I grew up. Thank you, Wayne. Gave me a good start. But I really wanted to, I needed to go to that next step. And I heard about Jim, and he was out at Peterson Ranch, and heard he was pretty tough. And I asked him when I left the company I was working for if I could ride with him. And Of course, it was going to be really hard. He wanted me cleaning stalls, feeding, watering, doing all those things, all the hard labor that comes